Hello and welcome to the third Minor Conversations podcast. And today we're having a bit of a switch up in format. In the case that we're talking about a book, but not a book that we've published, but a book that is so awesome, we kind of wish we did publish it. It's that cool. So today we're talking with Abigail Susik. I hope I got your name right. Did I get it rightish? Okay. About her book, Surrealist Sabotage and the War on Work. So thank you for coming along.
Yay, I'm so excited to be here. And that's such a nice thing to say. I'm delighted because your work, Stephen, has been important for my research, and also everything that you're doing in the podcast and then the book series looks fantastic. And I was really excited to see that activity. So thank you for the invitation.
Well, thank you for those kind words. As we were talking about a bit before we started, a lot of times doing research and writing, particularly books, can feel super isolating. And then you spend years and years and put it out in the world and you say, I hope someone sees it and actually gives a crap about it. And so it's when actually someone does it, you're like, oh, wow, it's actually a thing that people like.
It was particularly the case for me with this book because I wrote a lot of it on a sabbatical just before the pandemic started, and then was finishing it and doing all of the kind of extensive editing and image copyright work during the pandemic. And so I truly felt like I was in a bit of a vacuum in that time. And now, we're still dealing with the end of the pandemic, having the book just have come out in October. It's interesting to have the lifespan of the project be in some ways aligned with the shutdown that we were all experiencing. So writing a book is always kind of like being in a cave, right?
Yeah, but I can imagine it's extra difficult when it comes out now, because at least for me, when a book is finished, I like having book releases. It's almost like a baby is born and everyone gets together and celebrates it, and it's kind of fun, and you get to say, oh, finally, okay.
And hand out cigars or whatever. Yes.
Yeah, or the equivalent of that. But yeah, if you don't get that, it kind of feels like, yeah, did it actually happen? But so let's try to pretend that this isn't as fun as having a book party and having glasses of wine and having your friends around. But oh well, we'll do what we can. Cool. So maybe to kick off with, and as as a starting thing to talk about, so like in pop culture, and sort of like let's say the lowest common denominator version of surrealism becomes sort of like, it's just some weird stuff, man. Like, here's a lobster phone. Here's some like weird things we've tacked on. Artists are weird. No one knows why they're doing this. Now, obviously, as an art historian, you don't traffic in that kind of, let's say, cliches of surrealism. But what I really like about what you do in this book is you say, no, it's not about that. It's actually a key, let's say, element of surrealism is actually a focus on the refusal of work. So one of the things here you say, on page 33, is that work refusal is best understood as a core precept of the movement, and one which you can best see not through, let's say, particular biographical facts or events, but as let's say a long-term orientation, which I think is super exciting, because I'm, like many people, I kind of hate work too. So I want to start off by just talking about sort of how you see the sort of relationship between surrealism and work refusal, and what that tells us about surrealism.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the book came about in a number of different ways, and I won't review all of that. But essentially, through my work, what I came to see, what was extremely unique about the movement, was its very clear and adamant stance of wage labor abolitionism. And there are lots of different historical moments of surrealism in different geographical places. So I focus in particular on the Paris group in the mid-1920s with their development of wage labor abolitionism. And then some of the various surrealist groups around the world over the course of the 20th century also adopt that position. But you have to be a little careful with surrealism because it's such a huge and long-term movement that blanket statements are challenging. But certainly that initial Paris group right after World War I were interested not in wage labor reform, but in what we would call a post-capitalist orientation today, or a complete rehaul of the way that people survive in society. And so certainly they wanted the abolition of capitalism, and they were revolutionaries in that ideological sense, at least. But one of the main targets was the wage labor system, and in a way that I thought was really fascinating was that in terms of their own, what you might call activism or their own praxis, they pursued strategy, a number of them, particularly the core group that founded the magazine La Révolution Surrealiste, the Surrealist Revolution, this idea of permanent strike, which I also found fascinating. So an idea of durational, long-term resistance to the wage labor system through means that are not totally perfect, right? Like embracing precarious labor and gigging, trying to have collective solidarity together in terms of supporting one another in living situations and other kinds of opportunities. And that combination of a really stringent wage labor abolitionism with a life tactic that I found to be very ambitious in a way. Maybe that's not the best word to use when you're talking about permanent strike. But this kind of adamant refusal and withdrawal from the wage labor system, it just seemed to me to be, remarkably prescient, kind of thinking about what we're dealing with today, and also very unique within the avant-garde. And so when I realized what I was dealing with, that gave me enough energy to say, let's do an entire study of this. And yes, that subject is at odds with, the pointy mustaches and melting watches side of surrealism, and maybe a real surprise for some readers, because there's so much literature on surrealism these days, and a lot of it is not very political. And so I think the book comes off as a kind of surprise, perhaps. I mean, even for myself, I was surprised by some of the things I discovered.
And of course, there's nothing wrong with pointing mustaches and melting watches. I mean, that stuff is cool too. But it's just interesting finding out that there's so much more going on that sort of, let's say, has been edited out or forgotten. One of the things that I find quite interesting in the way you talk about surrealism and work refusal is a lot of times what I've been reading, about the history about the relationship between art and labor, the kind of labor that is presumed as a backdrop that art labor is compared to is often usually industrial labor. So if you look at like the Art Workers Coalition, the idea of what is the worker would be the factory dude, right? And the take you get here about surrealism refusing work, their conception of work seems to be more based upon, let's call it like middle class labor or immaterial work, which in some ways makes them actually sort of anomalous in the history of the relationship of art and labor, but also seems that makes them, if anything, more relevant today, because that is the dominant form of labor that we're immersed in, which is how we can now, have been working from home for 2 years for a lot of us who are, let's say, able to do that kind of work remotely, right? So if anything, it would seem their relationship with work based upon the kind of work that they were involved in somehow puts them out of time with their time, but if anything, more connected to the present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great observation. And that puts the group and the study in a slightly difficult position. And they always were conscious of that. They would talk about the real workers, the people on the factory floor. And this French group in the 20s and 30s were adamantly in support of proletarian class struggle. And that wasn't necessarily always an easy relationship. And there are some instances in which surrealists, particularly trying to work with the French Communist Party, weren't able to actually establish any kind of substantial solidarity with proletarian factory workers. But I agree, like the kind of difficulty of the surrealist position in terms of its class alignment is part of what attracted me. Why would they have such an adamant wage labor abolitionist stance if they're essentially like bourgeois or middle class? And so they, this is where the like timeliness of the situation, historical situation, comes in for me, because with the birth of the movement in 1924, 25, you have an immediate post-World War I environment in Europe. Most of the original surrealists are veterans of that war, extremely young. And then you have them living in the influenza pandemic right after the war, with the total devastation of the economic market in France, and huge inflation and massive strikes. And it was just a total turmoil in terms of the labor situation in France. And so that made it a little easier to understand their kind of level of consciousness. But the other thing that's happening is that these surrealists, most of whom are men, are training in professional careers in medicine and in law, particularly, and they drop out of these careers and realize that the kind of work that might await them with their studies and their middle class backgrounds is what we would call knowledge work. And so, or information and material labor, which, as you said, is sort of so ubiquitous now for many people. And so that status of information labor and the potential for a new kind of work overtaking, so many lives and hours fascinated me. And so I did, and I think you can see in certain chapters kind of jump off from that point of saying, what can we see about information labor, or like the birth of an information society in surrealism? And I'll just say, to make one more bridge, they were conscious of the fact that art, is a particular kind of labor or a particular kind of commodity. And so that was another really difficult thing. I think a lot of things about their position are not clear, not easy, which is why it hasn't been written about a lot. But just like today, where we're having so many discussions about, the creative class and artists as workers, they were beginning to grapple with that. And so aligning artwork, immaterial artwork, with the kind of information labor society or the rise of a professional managerial class was also important to my thinking. I hope that makes some sense. I'm not sure if I answered your question directly.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I'm just thinking about what you were talking about a few seconds ago about this. Let's say, surrealism at that point, its complicated relationship to communist parties, and I'm imagining how to, let's say, because this is a point where, I'm guessing at this point, let's say 20s and 1930s, Freud is maybe like read very marginally, not marginally, but like, let's say he's read by, let's say, elite circles or sort of the upper middle class, but like there isn't sort of like this popular understanding of repressed ideas or Freudian slips, right? So so you have these, let's say, more aesthetically, generally more aesthetically conservative Communist Party apparatchiks who are like, what the hell is going on here? And I guess that's why you get all these sort of like denunciations of like, we have no idea what you guys are doing, but it's completely bizarre and we don't like it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yeah. The relationship with the Communist Party was so fraught. Their relationship, really an interesting story.
Which is kind of unfortunate, because if I could imagine how that could be, let's say, a more fruitful relationship, I would imagine surrealism as, I'd reframe it as, let's say, developing tools for, let's say, psychic liberation, or attempting to sort of find, let's say, your way through, let's say, getting yourself out of ideology, or finding what your desires are. And there would be, let's say, moments where that might have been explored. I think maybe I think there are bits of constructivism that was sort of went in that direction a little bit, but otherwise I'm guessing that was sort of viewed as a very sort of like bizarre thing to be doing at the time.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Because I think, of course, the surrealists really tried to align with the PCF, the French Communist Party, for a number of years, about 7 years, very adamantly, it was extremely important to them. And although the PCF was always sort of like a raised eyebrow, and we could talk about why that would be, it was a number of things, along with the work abolitionist stance of theirs that was sort of like, how does this really fit with, the actual party line at the time? But the essentially, I think I sort of lost my train of thought for a second and thinking about all of the bad relationships there. But yeah, I mean, the surrealist revolution of the mind for me is a great way, a very straightforward way, actually, in a sense, to understand why the party alignment didn't work. And so if they could have interfaced with Marx himself, and I think maybe there would have been some common ground, because I actually, every time I read Marx, I'm like, there's more here than just the overthrow of the capitalist structure and the various processes of production. There's a larger picture for Marx, but I think that for the surrealists, even if the overthrow of capitalism had been achieved in a revolutionary sense, that wouldn't have been enough. Like they wanted the revolution of the mind, and so that's why technology couldn't save us for them, or accelerationism wouldn't have been enough. That they thought that the human mind is already like a machine, and the human mind is vulnerable to various forms of control in an individual sense, and so that's where they try to bring in the Freudian ideas. I know that's sort of where like Freudian repression meets with Marxist false consciousness in a really interesting way in surrealism, that the human mind would continually need to be liberated along with the societal structures. Do you see what I'm saying? And so that's just a great way, Stephen, to go right to the heart of the problem and why political parties, they never could quite, it just wasn't quite the right fit for them. And that's why I explored ideas of autonomy a lot, and why they've gotten such a bad rap in political histories, because, it looks like a failure on paper. I mean, it is kind of a failure. It's like a divorce with the PCF in the mid 1930s. It's a horrible divorce between surrealism and the Communist Party. And not an amicable divorce, and where friends are lost on both sides, people defect, etc. It is kind of a failure of solidarity, but possibly with with an end result that is a bigger picture, and I'm interested in that kind of non-alignment as a possibility for broader horizons, if that makes sense.
Were there any connections made? This is such a more elaborate question, with communist parties, but not through the party structure itself. But what I mean by that is, one book which you mentioned a few times is it's Michael Sedman's "Workers' Revolt Against Work," which I think is quite interesting in how it frames that the sort of ways that communist parties at that time were totally into a certain productivist ideal, which was then held as a sort of regulating idea of how work was understood, and anything which did go along with that was held to basically be like anti-communist. So I would think you could find large sections of, let's call it the industrial working class, the working class more generally, that would be totally on board with, we don't want to be working ourselves. We hate this as well. So they maybe put up with some of, let's say the weirdness. But I think if they got down to the core of the sort of attempt to like live out your desires for not working, they'd be on board, with a lot of that.
I mean, I'm not an expert in like early 20th century French communism, like as opposed to early 20th century Russian communism. I think there's some party differences across the countries that are, you would really want to have like regional expertise. But I think the one of sort of the dominant idea is that the party at this time was mostly on paper productivist or workerist, in the sense that the worker is celebrated as the core of the ethos, that the worker will be the foundation of the new society, the new communist society, and that work will be the heart of the communal work will be the heart of that society. Um, and so, already a conflict there, obvious, like in terms of surrealism, because even if it's communist work, if it is, communal work in a non-capitalist society, that's still workerist in a way that surrealism, I think, had a problem with. And so I think they tried to envision a non-capitalist future for work, and that was difficult for them. They mostly kind of stayed in a work refusal type position, or a skepticism about the role of labor in one's life. I mean, it's hard to imagine what work would be like if it's not wage labor, because we're all in that system, right? So they struggled with that. But yeah, I mean, Seidman's book was interesting for me, and I was able to find there were definitely party members, factory workers who were, people who were interested in strike tactics and sabotage, who were not just straight up productivists, like glorifying the machine, and work as the essence of a communist life. And so one of the key ideas for me was when I learned that something called chômage volontaire was considered a sabotage tactic, which is voluntary unemployment, which is like so close to what we're seeing with what people are calling the anti-work movement today.
The Great Resignation.
The Great Resignation, exactly. Yeah. So, but the chômage volontaire, as to think of that as a tactic, I was like, okay, wait a second, like this is a chink in the armor, in like the workerist armor, where we could maybe see that there would be radical positions that were anti-capitalist and possibly pro-communist, that didn't have a simple formulation for the work state as a solution for capitalism, or that there might be problems with that along the way. And so that's when, and I'll not to jump to something else, but that's when Italian operaismo ideas helped me, even though they're out of sync with surrealism. Some of those ideas, and I'm also not an expert in that area, but those ideas were really helpful, because there you have workers in the 70s, factory workers who were also, not glorifying work per se, or they're problematizing work as such. And so that I said, well, this is a position that has some similar valences with surrealism.
I can see the big similarities there. I mean, maybe less in this, like, let's say the early to mid 60s operaismo, but when you get into the 70s and you have someone like Bifo talking about like Mao Dadaism and the avant-garde comes into the factory, that almost seems like the sort of, what surrealism could have been in the factories 50 years earlier if it had gotten there, but it didn't.
Yeah.
Were the 20s and 30s surrealists reading? You probably already said this, but were they reading books like, I always say his name wrong, Paul Lafarge?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess it would be Lafarge. Yeah. So from what I have seen, they didn't discover Lafarge until the early 30s. And I'm not sure if this was a situation of like just being able to get their hands on the publication, because it was a weird little book, even in its time in the 1880s. And so they were first and foremost poets, the initial group members, who then really studied Marxism extensively in the second half of the 1920s. And so they came a little bit late to some of those texts that were more unorthodox. I would actually say Lafarge is sort of unorthodox, even though he's Marx's son-in-law. Like it's a very unique text. And so that they were, as they started to interface more with communists and also have members like André Thirion, who was a communist activist or a party activist, who was a surrealist too, that's when they started to get more exposure to texts like Lafargue's book. But yeah, by the early 30s, they were checking it out. And in particular, Thirion is responding to Lafargue. You don't get a lot of response to Lafargue from other surrealists, although they knew about him. Actually, there's much more attention given to Charles Fourier, the early 19th century utopian socialist. especially by Breton in the 40s. But you would think that there would be more like, like shout outs to Lafargue and surrealism, and there really aren't. And I'm not sure where that is, but I do write about him pretty extensively in the book, because Lafargue he's talking about the desire for like a 4-hour workday. And I think it's a 15-hour work week, which some people thought was satirical, but also was kind of serious, right? I mean, this is in the 1880s, so that's pretty dramatic when you don't even have the 8-hour workday yet. Like, it's another 40 years until you have in France a legalized 8-hour day. You don't even have the 40-hour work week until like 36 in France. So you'd think, and of course, the right to be lazy as the title also might have appealed, but you don't get like quite as much of a celebration as him as you would think. And we could talk about why that is, perhaps. One thing I'll say is that Lafargue is an apologist for technology, and most surrealists have a more reserved or critical view of technology. So that might be one of the reasons.
Oh, I should flag up for people listening that the book we're talking about is Paul Lafargue's book, The Right to be Lazy, which is super excellent, and it actually connects a number of threads you talk about in the book. Because I mean, thinking about in the most recent version of it that was published by AK Press, the preface is written by I'm not even going to try to say his last name, Bernard, the really nice Polish guy last name. Do you know how to say his last name?
Marszalek.
That guy, yes. Who was
Bernard is great.
Yeah, who was either adjacent to or possibly part of the sort of 60s scene, or debatable whether he was a part of the Surrealists or whether he was just like hanging out with them into the 60s. But
Bernard, he's like was really great for we've been interlocutors for years, and he gave me some really important corrections, and we're essentially correspondents, and Bernard would be a great person to interview in general. And if you're listening, like, check out Bernard's work. He is definitely the most active anti-work writer that I know of in the States. And so he's completely knowledgeable on the subject. And he is, Lafargue for him is absolutely central.
Yeah, but it's interesting the way that even if Lafargue wasn't being read a lot, it's sort of his work is sort of a minor current that keeps coming up again and again over many years. But we'll get back to Chicago in a second. But I wanted to go back a second to what you were talking about with technology, which I think is quite interesting, where you have this interesting tension between, let's say, an approach to understanding work refusal that says, okay, if we automate everything, then we don't have to do the work. So there's a certain kind of, let's say, call it like work refusal oriented accelerationism versus a sort of actually maybe that's not a good idea. And I was wondering, you tell me a little bit more about this sort of tension between, let's say, the more I guess I'll be really call it, let's say, is there tech bro surrealism versus like Luddite surrealism?
So, oh my gosh, it's really fun to apply any of those words to surrealism. Yeah, right. Okay. There definitely is some tension in the group. Tension's a good word for a lot of aspects of the subject matter. And in surrealism in general, there's a lot of unresolved tensions. But so through a lot of work, I did a lot of work on this because it's a very challenging set of ideas with surrealism, because on the one hand, it seems like they might love the machine. They're constantly making works of art that are talking about machines. They're following in the footsteps of poets like Guillaume Apollinaire and Alfred Jarry that are interested in like the avant-garde sexualization of the machine, the sort of techno-sexuality, techno-eroticism. So there's like, it seems to be a little avidity for the machine in surrealism. But when it comes to like saving us, I would say by and large, there is great reserve, if not a total scoffing at that idea of, if we speed up, accelerate technological development and we go to automation, then we reduce the need for so many wage workers and excess production, and we're going to solve a lot of problems that way. I think that they they had immense fear and concern about that idea. And you see it all the way through the 60s. And in the mid 60s, they have an exhibition in France called Absolute Deviation, L'écart absolu, where you have the exhibition filled with sort of fake machines. And I only talk about it briefly in my book. It's in the epilogue, which is about Konrad Klappek and his, is a German painter associated with Surrealism who painted sort of portraits of machines, if you will. But the exhibition, Absolute Deviation, was sort of like derailed machines, machines that had become monsters or sort of nightmarish versions of themselves. And so there were a couple of apologists for technology. That guy, Andre Thirion, that I mentioned, who writes, some very important texts about anti-wage labor, and also against sort of capitalism's money hunger. He's so amazing, Thirion. If you haven't checked him out, he writes an essay called "Down with Work" in the late 20s. That is like at the heart of surrealist work refusal. But anyway, he like Lafargue had hopes that technology could solve some of these problems, and he's the only one that's coming to mind that actually thought that might help us. There might have been others, and if you read between the lines of the millions of surrealist texts, you could find more. But Breton at least, and this is something I worked out at the end of the book. So he, from what I understand, at least by the end of his life, he literally thought that humans were kinds of machines, and he was interested in a human-machine potential for symbiosis, so that he talked about like demasking the properties of machines, and almost like a détournement, like a overturning of function. He used the word override, and essentially in French translation, to override function for both humans and machines would be a way out of the productivist mindset. And so it's strange to align the human with the machine. Takes you to a different set of ends. It takes you to a different set of possibilities and requirements for liberation. So I wouldn't call them technophobes or Luddites. It's like a little different, Well,
that almost sounded like you were describing Breton less as a tech bro, more as a post-humanist, which would be even stranger.
Yes, that's exactly the word I use, like with great reservation. I like throw that word out in the epilogue, and I'm like, I'm sort of flirt with it in a few of the chapters, because the surrealists thought machines were sexy. I mean, they were interested in how the machine, I have a whole chapter about the machine and masturbation, very weird chapter, speaking of weird, but yeah, post-human perspective is I think maybe a word we could use that would work for at least some of Breton's ideas by the 60s.
One of the things in your book that I actually found generally laugh out loud funny is when you're talking about relationship to particular kinds of machines like typewriters or sewing machines, and you have the whole thing about like the sexual dangers of sewing machines, and it's just like really. I guess you could create moral panics about almost anything. So I guess sexy sewing machines was definitely a big danger in the 1920s.
And I think that the surrealists thought that was really funny too, because it was a 19th totally outdated, outrageous, ridiculous 19th century medical discourse, second half of the 19th century, about women working on sewing machines, garment workers who were coming into the workforce, by the thousands in France in particular. And supposed phenomenon of working your treadle, which is the pedal at the bottom of the machine. And the machine is not electric yet, but is sort of shaking, and you're in a hot room. They're using little irons, at the other end of the room, where they heat the iron in the fire, and it's just hot, and there's all this rattling and machines in these sweatshops essentially, and women having involuntary orgasms, and it's a real medical discourse. And so the surrealists thought that was hilarious too, kind of a funny joke, and used that as, in a way, a kind of emblem of what their attitude toward overwork was. Let's just have multiple orgasms, and we'll thwart the system. That's our form of sabotage.
Well, that makes it sound quite appealing. I mean, it's funny because I mean, like, I'm actually not even sure how working a sewing machine with your feet would even lead to. I mean, I suppose the depressing thing is realizing that the people who are writing this are probably medical professionals who are married to people who probably have very unsatisfying sex lives.
Yeah,
Say,
but the idea was if you sat, like literally they wrote about this, if you sit at the end of your seat and you've got your feet on the treadle, it creates a pressure. So to work the treadle, you had to sit at the end of the seat. So it was, and your legs are open. I mean, this is all, I'm not making this up. This is all written about the position of the labor that was required and like the kind of repetitive automatism of the work, just sort of mindlessness of it would lead to this physical hypnosis and orgasmic release, which was scary. It was not good. It was not like nice. It was for these doctors who imagined this a really dangerous thing that could lead to being infertile, not being able to produce more workers, or lesbianism, or nymphomania, things like this that would, and of course, just the sheer degeneracy of self-pleasure for women is not allowed.
That's definitely bad. I'm sure these dudes are probably absolutely scared of bicycles.
Bicycles too, of course. It was written to Havelock Ellis, who was actually a pretty legitimate sexologist, British sexologist in the early 20th century, ties in the old sewing machine lore with bicycles, trains. Of course, horseback riding is an old issue, and also talks a lot about crochet and knitting needles. And he basically says, Ellis says that anything humans can find, any implement to give self-pleasure, they will use. And Ellis is okay with that. He just says that's part of human nature.
But just amazing, sort of the paranoia. But
yes.
Going back a second, maybe we talk a bit about automatisms and sort of the idea of automatisms, which I find quite interesting, although I'm not quite exactly sure, how to engage with. And this sort of idea of a certain kind of automatisms and how they function, and the way that they can be understood as a kind of sabotage or breaking down of work.
Yeah, that's when I wrote the book, I thought that the chapter on Oscar Dominguez and sewing machines was possibly the most challenging for readers. But I'm wondering now if chapter 2 on surrealist automatism as a form of sabotage is possibly more obscure. And so we'll see, how that goes over time for people. But the idea of that chapter is, if you know anything about surrealist automatism, its kind of core precept is that you submit to the dictation of the unconscious. There's a complete passivity that one must attain according to the surrealist procedure, where you shut down the conscious mind and you, as faithfully as possible, allow the voice of the unconscious mind to move through you out into some arena in which it could be recorded or perceived. So you might be writing it down by hand. You let it, you listen to the voice and the inner voice and you let it come out, or you recite it live and someone else writes it down or records it or types it. So there's a dictation function going on. Now, a lot of people discount the surrealist faith in an unconscious mind that can be tapped into. And I think that's legitimate. We don't really have to believe in that. It's sort of, in order to understand some of the things that we're dealing with, we can at least kind of run with them there. But essentially, it's sort of the dream life, this idea that you could, I have vivid dreams every night. My dream life is really active. And so I'm very aware of that part of my brain. And they were interested in that too. So it's as if it's not exactly a waking dream state in the early ways in which they discuss their theory of automatism in the 20s. It is more like a running voice. They were poets, so they're quite interested in the language in particular. And I don't think dreams are necessarily about language. They're, for me, very image based. But in any case, that was the hope. And so I began to look at, automatism has been written about by like everybody, over the last 100 years, surrealists, scholars, so many people, there's so much written, but I became kind of obsessed with an image of Simone Breton, the first wife of Andre Breton, who was a surrealist and a very active member of the group, not often written about as such, not often featured in surrealist histories, because she leaves the marriage and, is only more tangentially associated with surrealism after the 1920s. She remains involved and she becomes an art dealer essentially. But there's a famous image of her by Man Ray surrounded by male surrealists, and she's at the typewriter, and it's kind of the quintessential image of surrealist automatism. So I wanted to know why she's at the typewriter, what is the dynamic of the photo? And that led me into a whole set of questions about automatism as a form of labor or a form of non-labor, which are quite complex and I think go through a number of convolutions. But essentially, and as you know, I came to think of automatism, surrealist automatism, as a form of work to rule sabotage, which was a submission to dictation, a submission to a kind of dominance that ultimately is a tool for liberation. Not a perfect tool, not a complete tool, but a very powerful tool. And so work to rule sabotage, if you don't know what that is one type of sabotage. There are many, many species of sabotage. And I think the most common one is stealing time on the job, right? Everybody does that. It's ubiquitous. But work to rule sabotage is where you, and I'd be interested to see, Stephen, how you would define it, but basically you exaggerate compliance. So if you're supposed to, maybe you actually can work too fast or something. Like if you're supposed to have a quota that you meet, you work so fast that you do sloppy work. That's a speed up also. But essentially you follow the rules, you comply with the rules so extensively that you thwart production in some way. And there are a number of ways you could thwart production. So compliance, submission, the trappings of compliant labor, and I became very interested in questions of stenography, secretarial labor, information labor, and the gendered labor of feminized office work. That would maybe possibly help us move toward a more materialist interpretation of automatism, because it has the history. I realize I'm going on for a minute here. I'm going to stop in a second, but the history of the analysis of this absolutely central surrealist idea, it never goes away. It has largely been poetic, and that's fine, or has been kind of a cult. But I had to understand how that for them could relate to their wage labor abolitionism, and so that was my attempt to do that.
I can see how you're doing that in terms of you're trying to unpack the notions of automatism, but by looking at how it's connected to particular forms of labor and machines that underpin and make it possible. And that sort of, let's say that more materialist analysis of the stuff and the practices tends to be forgotten in just looking at the text or the outcomes.
Yes.
I guess the way that I would make the connection, and there's two ways which let's say I'm finding tension here, is the first is the tension between automatism as submission to a rule, but submission to a rule which is in a practice of trying to find freedom. So I always find that sort of tension quite interesting, which you can see across many different histories and traditions. But the way I would connect automatism to maybe other, let's say, notions of work refusal or sort of work to rule strikes is the way I understand work to rule strikes is that the rules or formal procedures in any workplace can only stipulate so much of how work is actually done. There's always something on top of that. There's always excess cooperation, understanding, informal knowledges, practices which make basically the workplace function. And once you actually sort of strip those away, you're back to a very non-functioning workplace. So it seems almost, and this might be maybe this is a counter notion, is that the informal workplaces that make things function are actually the sort of unconscious of a workplace that you're stripping away by a more traditional work to rule strike. And this is kind of a different version of it. We're trying to access what is the unconscious or the sort of subconscious of a practice.
Oh, that's so interesting. Right, absolutely. And I think I mean, I think this relates to sort of, so at the core of automatism is language. And language could be rote, language could be minimizing and controlling. In a way, we live in the kind of prison of language, right? If we want to communicate with one another, this is the form we use. It's extremely frustrating sometimes. And yet it's so much more than that, right? I mean, there's so much more that is involved with speaking to one another. And so in a way, the one fundamental level, automatism is the subversion of language function in the instrumentalized sense. And so that does align with surrealism's literal hope for poetry never goes away, poetry as a key for liberation, that a poetic mindset and a poetic, I wouldn't even call it, maybe sort of like epistemology, if that's possible, could free individuals. They're actually very interested in individual liberation as a prefiguration of collective liberation, so that and this is not that different from, I would say, what like post-structuralism was interested in later on, is just this idea that language is the key to societal structure. And so if we can approach that differently, that might help us move toward other forms of liberation. Now, it's not that easy to say, how does playing with language actually going to help us with materialist liberation and things like getting enough food and medical care, and that's a huge gap. I realize that, and it can seem this is where surrealism can start to seem completely out of touch, but we have to remember they are artists, and this is an avant-garde, and I use that word for surrealism, even though some people say that doesn't fit surrealism, and avant-garde is something else. Anyway, it's a long kind of boring discussion, but I do tend to think that on the micro level, the examination of little things like how we talk to one another or how we think through words I agree with them. So for instance, like, if Karl Marx is talking about the automatism of machines and the automatic expansion of capitalism via productivism, could we relate those words of Marx's to the idea of automatism and surrealism? Right? It's a huge leap to do so, but there are some, sort of like what you were saying, like there's so much more to factory work than just the nuts and bolts of production and the what we might call the institutional rules. There's always more that exceeds that. I think that links to some degree with the surrealist approach to language. And I'll say one more thing. I'll say that I became really interested in a word of Foucault's. I don't use a lot of Foucault in the book, but he uses this word dressage, which is an equestrian term, which is like this idea that dressage is like the trappings of control. So if you have the dressage of information labor, you have your little office outfit and your little position that you take at the typewriter, and your attitude of submission to the boss, whatever, the kind of etiquette and accessorizing of work. That reminds me of what you were just saying about the difference between what we might call protocol in the factory, and then the broader set of human actualities, people working on the line. Do you see what I'm saying? So this procedures interested me.
If you want to make the connection literal, I had a colleague, guy named Simon Kelly, who did a research project about way that managers, particular training program where managers were taught about management through dressage, through learning about horses, and learning about how to command and work with a horse was used as a sort of management training technique. So this was
amazing.
This would be a very literal, like, let's say, usage of those techniques. And I don't know how that. Okay, I could imagine the ways that could inform your management style, but
Yeah.
it either gets very creepy, and the next I'm thinking of the second half of that film, Sorry to Bother You, and things get really weird very quickly. But yeah, but I guess as a sort of corporeal, let's say, technique of holding one's body, of creating a sort of particular relationship between bodies, of command and certain gestures. But going back a second, I guess the way that I make think of those kinds of automatism in a more, let's say, practical political sense would be, if you want to talk about what your desires are, what you're striving for, you might think you have direct access to that information, to those desires, but actually you don't, because they're so mediated by layers of socialization, by culture, by the functions of language, by all these things. And you could say that the only way you're actually going to figure out what you really want is by going deeper into your own mind and trying to get to those things. And yeah, you could say that automatism as a practice doesn't necessarily get directly there, but you could also say it's maybe gets you at least closer.
Yeah, that was their hope. That was their hope that I mean, it's Freudian for sure that we could, like, face our inner animal, and realize that all of us have violent and kind of outrageous desires on some level, and so this sort of I don't know, animalizing of the human, maybe. I mean, maybe this is the way I think about surrealism. I'm sure some people would heartily argue with me about many points that I've said here. We all have our take, and this is kind of my take, what I've learned from surrealism. But yeah, I mean, I think it may seem naive that by doing this practice of listening to the unconscious on a daily basis, when you're awake, with feasibly what could look like, kind of work tools and work attitudes and work behaviors, that actually you could unravel your submission to, I mean, the thing where we get up every day and we work, like we know we have to survive. I have to work to live. And, if I don't earn a wage, I can't eat in this society unless I, learn to be a really good farmer very quickly and can have enough land to do that, et cetera. But these things are obvious. But I think they really thought that I don't know if they would like this word, but as a kind of deconditioning tool, that would be a practice in the sense that it was something that was readily accessible. Anyone could do it. Automatism, there are many different ways of doing it. You could do it collectively. You can make the exquisite corpse. You could have a kind of automatist seance where people are talking in a trance state. You could do it on a page alone or with people in terms of writing. That would be one of the ways that we could break out of the spell that we're under. And so, is that sabotage? And to some degree, I think we could call automatism, even if you don't kind of buy my theory of it as being related to information labor, a kind of satire of information labor was essentially what I'm saying. Even if you don't buy that, I think most people could agree that automatism was meant to be liberationist. But how does it do that is another question.
Well, I guess it also gets on to the second thing I was thinking about, is that I could see understanding it as a kind of sabotage or work refusal in the context. But once we get to the wonderful stage of, let's say, cognitive capitalism, creative labor, today's sense, where I'm thinking about, let's say, I went to a PhD student who was writing about the labor of designers and design workers, and he would talk about a lot of the practice was trying to, let's say, wander through the city or find particular environments where they could almost like sample the ambience and get ideas from around them. And it's almost like they were trying to tap into this sort of unconscious state of ideas and like a certain kind of creative flow. So in a certain way, you could say, for once you get to forms of creative labor and conceptual labor, that kind of automatism could actually shift from being a work refusal practice to just being a work practice.
Totally. Yeah. And I try to speak to that a little bit in the book. I think that actually is probably exactly why I got interested in the subject in that way. I was at work when I was teaching, when I was like, wait a second, this looks a lot like what I'm doing, that co-optation of creative labor. I mean, the co-optation of everything, but is something that's been written about pretty recently by different scholars of Marxism and everything, especially right in after the 60s, when you have the creative energies of the protest movement just being used to transform the way we do work and the way work is envisioned. That work is fun. We have like a brewery in our office. Like there's a trampoline in there and a climbing wall. Like
Ping
this is,
pong.
yeah, you don't even have to leave the fucking, pardon me, the work, you can edit that out, the work campus, like just live there, it's like a nightmare. So yeah, this is, if we had, like a surrealist with us today, and there still are living surrealists, we could say like, what do we need to do now that we're all producing labor all the time? And I don't believe that the free work we're all doing all the time is decommodified at all. I would not agree with that. I think everything is commodified, and all of the volunteer work we do on social media, et cetera, is actually commodified. We're just not reaping the benefits of it. Someone else is. Like, does automatism still have any value right now? I think it does. And of course, I'm an apologist for surrealism. I think it's relevant, but I think we all engage in it a little bit when we use our computer devices and phones, et cetera. I think that there is still a need to be conscious of the prosthetic relationship that we have and critical of it. And if we can kind of tap into some of the ideas about automatism and language, which of course is the kind of like juice of the information world, at least in information labor, maybe not so much the creative class as you were talking about. I think we could still find some means for deregulation, but again, that's an optimistic idea, and I don't have it mapped out. I don't have it mapped out exactly how that would work.
No,
I mean, that's hard, like making the leap from like the ideas to actually changing stuff,
I would definitely agree with you that there's still value to practices like that. Maybe it's almost just like appreciating how the context has changed and how it operates differently in that context. And speaking of that, another thing you do that I quite like is there's this very real tendency to act as if like surrealism basically like died at like that's like 1942, and totally ignore that, by the way, there are countries other than France and Belgium, and also there are times after that. So I really love on the chapter on Chicago surrealism, because that sort of period around the crossover of the IWW and the Solidarity Bookshop, and sort of this ferment of, let's say, call it like countercultural politics, labor, and surrealism, is super. I find super interesting, and hasn't been written about nearly as much as it could be.
Yeah. I'm really glad you like that chapter. It's a big, it's a really a 4-chapter book, and that's a big chunk of the book about Chicago surrealism, which so obviously surrealism, if you've seen the Surrealism Beyond Borders exhibition at the Met or the Tate, is a global, well, I'm not going to use that word, actually, is an international phenomenon over the course of the 20th century. And in Chicago, starting in the early 60s, you have a group of Midwest college students, most of them from working class or middle class backgrounds, who are in college at Roosevelt University, and are young activists, quite active in the civil rights movement, and then eventually the anti-Vietnam movement, and in a number of other initiatives, pro-worker initiatives, actually involved in strikes, assisting with strikes, that become union members of the Industrial Workers of the World, which is an old union that was founded in the early 20th century in the States, and is a fascinating realm of ideas, the IWW. But they also start getting interested in surrealism by 1962, and by 1966 some members of this group of students become surrealists. They form an American surrealist group. Now, there had been previous American surrealists, but not so much in a group as you had in Paris or other cities, Belgium, as you mentioned. So this is a group, and So there has been some great stuff written about them by people like Joe Pollock, and then they themselves, Penelope Rosemont, Franklin Rosemont, as you mentioned, Bernard Marzalek, who was not a surrealist, but was very closely associated with the group, and many others have been publishing and writing with Care Books and other publishers over, since then. So it's just a huge world of literature, and it's a terribly exciting set of ideas that are really important for my book because they were wage labor abolitionists too. And so I think more than any other group after the Paris group had and have a clear position of wage labor abolitionism, that they want to abolish the system of wage labor, down with work. So yeah, that's something I talk about extensively. In particular, they talk about a journal called Rebel Worker that was pre-surrealist before they became surrealists, but has a lot of surrealist components mixed with IWW components, union aspects. And then, as you know, the second part of that study is about their exchange with Herbert Marcuse, the Frankfurt School philosopher.
One of the things that the Chicago people do, I think, is quite interesting. Maybe this is coming out of like the counterculture all the time, but their interest in, let's say, what I think what you call a sort of vernacular surrealism. So they say surrealism not just in formal artistic practices, but in things like cartoons, everyday culture, jokes, but in a way that seems, at least in my mind, it makes it actually much more or easily relatable, because it's not just in art, but it's almost everywhere. And that's partially because I suspect by that point, actually, there had been enough surrealist influence out of the art world that it was those ideas were seeping a lot into, pop songs and things like that. So, in some ways, this is something which makes the Chicago surrealists seem like, super relevant today. Which you could probably draw a direct line between, let's say, their work and, let's say, like certain versions of like online meme culture, right? Where you have the absurdism, but absurdism inflected with some kind of politics. So it's not just absurd for its own sake, but it's directed towards an end.
Yes, yeah, and that idea of vernacular surrealism is something that my friend Paul Buell, who is a great American activist and was involved in the student movement in the United States and published a lot with the Chicago Surrealists. He ran a magazine called Radical America for a long time. He thinks that is there, particularly Franklin Rosemont, who was one of the key members of the Chicago group. And if you've never read any Franklin Rosemont, I mean, go, not just for you, Stephen, but for listeners, get some of his books. He was prolific and, avoided the jobs, and so was able to really accomplish a lot in his publishing and writing. But Paul Buell thinks that Rosemont's main contribution is linking not only the older avant-gardes like surrealism with old left political ideas. So, like with the IWW before World War II, with pop culture, not only of the current time of the 60s and 70s, but also older pop culture. So there's a kind of like bridging of time and place in Franklin's elected affinities, and that kind of became a totally unique petri dish for Chicago surrealist orientation in a way that, I'm really interested in the broader radical culture of the 60s and resistance cultures, oppositional cultures. I'm interested in why the avant-garde why surrealism pops up in anarchist circles in New York in 1966. Like, why is it in these like far leftist journals? And according to Paul Buell, it was just a very unique current, like a unique kind of concoction that particularly the Rosemonts and their closest friends cooked up through what they thought was cool and what they thought was important, and how they wanted to change things in their lives. So it's just a totally rich subject, and there's so much more to be done on it.
I particularly really like Franklin's book, his biography of Joe Hill, which is just amazing how extensive it is, and how he sort of like takes these little aspects of Joe Hill's life and turns it and really unpacks them and says, okay, which is super interesting, and I don't think it's anyone else. And it's also interesting in how that sort of let's say it develops a conception of possible relationships between cultural production and labor. So it's not just about Joe Hill, but it's about other things through Joe Hill.
David Roediger believes that, and I think Paul Buell as well, that's Franklin's best book. So if you want to start somewhere, you can start with that. He was a great scholar of American labor, especially in Chicago and as related to the industrial workers of the world. And so it's like, it's a fascinating to be, he was also an immense scholar of Andre Breton, and these two aspects, you can't actually separate them in his mind and in his life. They're all together in one, which is why I had to write about that in my book.
I suppose another quite important thing that the Chicago Surrealists do is, maybe this is part of also the sort of counterculture and politics at that time, is making much more explicit links to no, actually, no, that was already there, but the way that they make connections to politics of race and colonialism. Yes. And I'm also thinking of, I get this happens afterwards, but the book that Franklin does, who's he edit with? You know the book Black, Brown, and Beige?
Yeah, with Robin Kelly. Yep.
Yeah, which is super interesting. And then you get this much broader history of surrealism outside of Europe, and going, oh, actually, there's things here happening in Algeria and Cuba and Martinique. Yes. And it's just sort of a much broader geographical history.
Totally. Yeah, I'm really interested in a future project in talking about race theories as connected to that group. And in the book, in chapter 4, I do talk a little bit about the way that the Chicago Surrealists linked white supremacy, particularly in the United States, with the wage labor state, because they were activists. They were interested in Black power. There were some connections with Black power in the group, and also, active striking in solidarity with the civil rights movement, or protesting. But I don't go into a lot of depth about that. But I'd like to talk about their idea of in connection. I mean, as a kind of like, it is in connection really, but broadening out from the notion of wage labor abolition in our society for them to the notion of the abolition of whiteness. So this idea that the construction of whiteness as a racial category is just that, a construction, and that its persistence as an ideological construction, these sort of racial groups that are distinct, is part of the overarching problem. So it's a very radical idea, obviously, and to some degree a speculative idea, but they pursue this in some publications, in particular in the 80s and 90s, that I'd really want to talk about in the next book.
Cool. We should probably start moving towards coming to a conclusion, since I don't want to sort of overtax the sort of listening labor of people. But maybe one thing we could sort of use to sort of get to a conclusion is to ask you, having unpacked these different histories of sort of surrealism, work, refusal, and the different iterations, maybe we could either go with, where do you see yourself going from here, or how do you see these things speaking to the present, and how you'd like to pursue like further ideas for unpacking these ideas more, going in another direction? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. I mean, I'm I'm kind of obsessed with this. When you finish your first book, there's like this immense anxiety, because it's like, where do you go now? And by the time you get to the end of a book, you're like so in it. It's extremely satisfying. And so, I've been thinking a lot about, because I finished the book during the time of the pandemic, and obviously these huge issues with work, the so-called Great Resignation, are coming up, and the kind of rise to awareness on a broader level of anti-work sentiment. Particularly, we're seeing this in the United States. And some people, give it more weight than others. Some people think that the Great Resignation, definitely millions of people have resigned, but there's some hemming and hawing about to what degree this means something. But so I am, and I always was with this book, wanted to connect my historical work to the present. And I really believe that historians, one of my hopes is that by studying radical histories or protest histories, that we can, assist in the memory of different oppositional cultural positions or oppositional tactical positions that might help us in the present. Because I do think that we need some help. That I do think that that the struggles, that there's should be some memory in terms of political struggle. That's my historian's position. So for the future, I am interested in working on this notion of white supremacy and how that comes up in the avant-gardes. I'm very interested in speculative post-capitalist ideas and the notion of how we can, get sort of negotiate the difference between practical change and future possibilities. So I think a lot about prefiguration, which I would call maybe more of an anarchist idea of imagining futures that are desired, even though there might not be a clear path to get to them. So prefiguration is really on my mind. And I'm interested in abolitionisms in general. And because I'm an art historian, I think a lot about abolitionism as related to iconoclasm and different forms of destruction, auto-destruction of artworks, things like this. So I'm thinking about a book that kind of combines these subjects. I'm not sure yet. It's called, right now, the working title is Change Life, which is the surrealists fixated on the Marxist idea of change life, or the Rimbaudin idea of to transform the world. They kind of actually interchanged them. Actually forget what the full title, working title is right now, but I'm in flux. I'm also working on a book with Paul Buell about Franklin Rosemont's pop culture writings. And I'm also interested in a journal called Resurgence from the 60s that is out of print, a far leftist anarchist journal that had avant-garde elements. And so I'm thinking about collaborating with a press here in Portland called Eberhardt Press, a wonderful anarchist press, in order to reissue those that journal Resurgence. And I just want to say one more thing before we conclude, Stephen. I really liked your question about art strikes. And now that you've pointed that out to me, I'm interested in writing about how Breton proposes the notion of an art strike in 1925 in a text that was published in his journal. So I'm also now thinking about some art strike work, thanks to you.
Cool. Well, that sounds really exciting. Look forward to seeing that stuff. And I just want to thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's so great to talk with you. And thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you.